She never imagined her body would be used to save the child of a man who didn't even know her name. Grace Williams was exhausted. Her shirt was damp with milk, her arms ached from cradling her 5-month-old son, and her back was sore from another double shift at the NICU. She wasn't a superhero. She was just a single mom trying to pay rent and keep diapers stocked. But that night, something happened that made her more than just a nurse. It was supposed to be a quiet end to a long shift. Grace had just finished pumping in the break room when the code blue alarm went off. A young pregnant woman had arrived at the ER after a fatal car crash. There was no time to save her, but they managed to deliver the baby barely breathing, premature, and desperately fragile. There was no family, no father present, just a tiny life clinging to breath and chaos. The neonatal team worked around the clock. IVs were inserted, machines beeped rhythmically, feeding tubes were adjusted, but the baby refused formula. Her body was too weak to process synthetic nutrients. Her oxygen levels were dropping fast. In a desperate meeting between doctors and nurses, someone asked the impossible. Did anyone know a lactating mother? Someone who could donate milk? Or even better, someone who could try to breastfeed? There was a long silence. Then someone whispered Grace's name. She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, not because she didn't want to help, but because she knew once she held that baby, her heart would never be the same. Still she nodded. They brought her to the neonatal room, placed the fragile infant against her skin, and for the first time in hours, the baby's heart rate stabilized. She fed, she lived, because of Grace. 2 hours later, the father showed up. He was tall, commanding, and wore a coat that looked more expensive than Grace's car. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. This man had just lost his wife, but when he saw his daughter alive, feeding in the arms of a stranger, he didn't shout or demand. He stood frozen, watching a woman he didn't know do the one thing no machine or doctor could do. His name was Ethan Carter, a billionaire tech founder, recently widowed, and now the father of a newborn he had no idea how to care for. Grace never thought she would see him again. But what he did next changed everything. There's a saying among NICU nurses: you don't choose your patients, but sometimes they choose you. That night, Grace didn't just save a baby. She became the unexpected center of a life that was unraveling. And slowly, without realizing it, she would change Ethan's life just as much as he would change hers. Sometimes, the most life-changing moments don't come in grand gestures or romantic fairy tales. They come in a quiet hospital room under harsh fluorescent lights, when one broken person does something extraordinary for another. What would you do if your body was the only thing that could save a stranger's child? And what if that moment was just the beginning? Grace Williams hadn't planned for this kind of life. At 30 years old, she was a full-time NICU nurse at Boston General Hospital and a full-time mother to a 5-month-old baby boy named Noah. Her mornings began before the sun rose and ended long after it set, usually with a bottle in one hand and a baby monitor in the other. Her apartment was small, tucked in a quiet but worn neighborhood just outside the city, with creaky floors and secondhand furniture, but it was filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet hum of survival. Grace had been on her own since the 3rd month of her pregnancy. Noah's father, once full of promises and poetic words, had disappeared the moment the reality of fatherhood came knocking. He had walked out during an argument, and days turned into weeks without a single call. Eventually, she stopped hoping. There was no child support, no co-parenting, just her, a stroller with a broken wheel, and a stubborn will to give her son a good life. Nursing had been her dream since high school, though she never expected she would end up in the neonatal intensive care unit. The first time she held a premature baby barely bigger than her hand, she cried, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of how fragile and beautiful life could be. NICU work was relentless, babies fighting to breathe, machines never silent, and families walking a tightrope between hope and heartbreak. But it gave Grace a sense of purpose. She couldn't fix her own life completely, but she could help save someone else's. Still, life outside the hospital was anything but easy. Her schedule left little room for rest. Between night shifts and early feedings, she was often running on caffeine and instinct. Grocery shopping had become a game of budgeting, and she kept a running list of diaper sales across 3 different stores. There were nights when she cried from exhaustion, silently rocking Noah in her arms while staring out the kitchen window, wondering if things would ever get easier. But there was one thing she never did give up. Her love for Noah was a fuel that kept her going. She saw him as her miracle, the reason her broken past didn't define her. She had grown up in a quiet town in Vermont, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still managed to tuck her in every night with a story. Her father had left when she was 9, a vague memory made up of empty chairs and promises he never kept. Grace knew what abandonment felt like, and she had sworn long ago that she would never pass that legacy on. She wanted her son to know what security felt like, what it meant to be chosen every single day. The hospital became her second home. The nurses she worked with were like family. They swapped shifts to help each other, shared breast milk when needed, and celebrated every ounce of weight gained by their tiny patients. Grace was respected not just for her skill, but for her heart. She had a calm presence that comforted panicked parents and soothed crying infants. And yet, despite all that strength, she still carried quiet fears. She feared the future. She feared something would happen to her and leave Noah alone. She feared being stuck in a loop where she gave everything but received nothing in return. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that one night, one baby, and one stranger would begin to shift everything she thought she understood about love, family, and second chances. At the time, Ethan Carter was just a name she heard whispered among the doctors. A high-profile patient's husband, rich, grieving, and completely disconnected from the newborn left behind. Grace didn't think much about him. She didn't have space in her mind for someone like that, someone whose world seemed so far removed from hers. But fate doesn't ask permission. It only waits for the right moment, and Grace's moment had just begun. Ethan Carter stood in the hallway of the NICU, staring through the glass at a scene that didn't make sense. His newborn daughter, swaddled in pale blue, was feeding quietly in the arms of a woman he didn't know. The woman had her dark hair tied back in a loose bun, her hospital scrubs slightly wrinkled, a badge clipped to her chest. Her expression was calm, focused, maternal. The baby, his baby, was alive because of her. Just hours earlier, Ethan had been in another city, locked in a boardroom negotiating a multi-million-dollar merger. His phone turned off, unaware that his wife was in an ambulance fighting for her life. By the time he arrived at the hospital, Isabel was gone, and all that remained was their daughter, born prematurely and barely holding on. He had missed everything. The birth, the final heartbeat, the last goodbye. Now, as he watched Grace cradle his daughter with a kind of reverence he couldn't understand, something inside him cracked. When he finally stepped into the room, his voice was hoarse. He thanked her, though the words felt inadequate. Grace looked up briefly, nodded, then turned her attention back to the baby. She wasn't seeking attention or gratitude. She was just doing what needed to be done. Over the next several days, Ethan returned to the hospital, always hovering at the edge of the room, always watching Grace with a quiet intensity. She continued breastfeeding the baby, who they had named Emma, 3 times a day, under a temporary hospital order signed by the medical board. It was highly unusual, but in this case, medically necessary. The bonding, the skin contact, the nutrition, all of it was saving Emma's life. At first their conversations were short, clinical. Ethan would ask how Emma was doing. Grace would reply with details about her weight, feeding intervals, and vitals. He was guarded, stiff, not used to being vulnerable or at the mercy of others. Grace was patient but distant. Her kindness automatic, not personal. They were 2 people from different worlds orbiting the same fragile center. But something began to shift. On the 6th day, during a late-night feeding, Ethan lingered longer than usual. He sat down across from Grace, his eyes tired, his voice softer than before. He asked about her son, Noah, and Grace hesitated before answering. She wasn't used to patients' families taking interest in her life. She told him Noah was 5 months old, healthy, and slept like an angel except when he didn't. Ethan smiled for the first time. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. That smile became a thread, weaving its way into their interactions. He started bringing coffee for her in the mornings. She began telling him little stories about NICU life, things that made him laugh quietly in a way that seemed unfamiliar even to him. Grace learned that Ethan wasn't just rich, he was brilliant, having built a tech empire from scratch after dropping out of MIT. But he was also awkward, emotionally stunted in ways that money couldn't hide. He confessed that Isabel had been the emotional core of their marriage, and without her, he didn't know how to connect with people, especially not with his daughter. Grace didn't offer comfort. She offered honesty. She told him it was okay to feel lost, that parenting wasn't about knowing everything but showing up anyway. She told him that sometimes the best thing you could do for a baby was simply to hold them and let them know you were there. Ethan listened. He started holding Emma more often. He asked Grace how to position her, how to burp her, how to read the little sounds she made, and each time, she showed him without judgment. As Emma grew stronger, the hospital board prepared to transition her care to in-home support. Ethan was overwhelmed. He didn't have a nanny yet, didn't trust strangers, and admitted that he was terrified of taking Emma home alone. Grace had expected their paths to separate at this point. Her role was temporary, a stopgap in a medical emergency. But then, Ethan made a request. He asked if she would consider coming home with him for a month, maybe 2, not as a nurse, not officially, but as someone Emma trusted. He offered to pay double her salary, cover daycare for Noah, and provide a private space for both of them in his house. Grace was stunned. It went against every line she had drawn between her professional and personal life. But when she looked down at Emma, now gripping her finger with surprising strength, she realized she couldn't walk away, not yet. She agreed, with strict conditions, boundaries, expectations, temporary. The move into Ethan's estate was surreal. The mansion sat on a hill overlooking the harbor, filled with sleek furniture, glass walls, and silence. Grace and Noah were given a guest wing, complete with a nursery, play area, and a private kitchenette. At first it was awkward. Meals were quiet, interactions polite. Ethan kept himself busy with work. Grace focused on the children, but the undercurrent of something unspoken pulsed between them. One evening, after Noah had gone to sleep and Emma had finally settled, Grace found Ethan in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying and failing to warm a bottle properly. She laughed, took the bottle from him and showed him how to swirl it, not shake. He asked her to stay a few minutes, poured her a glass of wine, and for the first time, they talked without shields. He asked her about her dreams, and she told him she used to want to be a pediatrician, but life had other plans. He shared that he had no idea what kind of father he would be, but he wanted to be present. Grace admitted she was afraid of letting anyone in, especially someone like him. He didn't flinch. He said quietly that money couldn't protect a heart from breaking, and in that moment, something between them cracked open. The days turned into weeks. Grace began to notice the way Ethan looked at Emma, the way his hands had learned to be gentle. She noticed how he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he lingered a little longer in shared spaces. They weren't just two people caring for a child. They were becoming something else, something unnamed but undeniable. Grace tried to ignore it. She told herself this was temporary, that rich men like Ethan didn't fall for single moms from the South Side. She reminded herself of the last time she trusted someone, how it ended in betrayal and loneliness. But hearts don't always listen to reason. They listen to presence, to moments, to small kindnesses that add up to something bigger. And Ethan began to realize that this woman, with her tired eyes and unshakable calm, wasn't just helping him survive parenthood. She was helping him live again. Grace knew this couldn't last, despite the warmth that had slowly filled the once cold mansion, despite the late-night talks and the silent looks that lingered longer than they should have. She reminded herself every morning that this was temporary. She was there because a baby needed her, not because she belonged. Yet each passing day made it harder to draw that line. One Saturday morning, Ethan came into the kitchen wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, holding Emma in one arm and Noah's favorite dinosaur toy in the other. He looked like any other exhausted father trying to keep up with two kids. Grace smiled and poured him coffee, and for a brief moment it felt like a real family. They started taking walks together with the babies, sometimes through the park, other times down quiet streets near the harbor. Grace would push Emma's stroller while Ethan carried Noah on his shoulders. Passers-by would smile at them, assuming they were a couple. Grace never corrected them, and neither did Ethan. Still, she felt the weight of their differences. He was a billionaire with a staff, lawyers, and stockholders. She was a nurse living paycheck to paycheck. Her presence in his life didn't fit, not in the long term. The turning point came when Ethan's mother-in-law arrived unannounced. Margaret Sinclair was tall, sharply dressed, and spoke with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. She had come to see her granddaughter, and immediately demanded to know who Grace was. Ethan introduced her politely, but Grace could feel the tension. During lunch, Margaret was all smiles to Ethan and all glances to Grace. She waited until Ethan stepped out of the room before speaking. "You're the nurse," she said, her voice cool. "I've heard about you. Ethan's been very generous lately. I assume you're being compensated well?" Grace kept her voice steady. "I'm here because Emma needed care. That's all." Margaret's smile tightened. "Let's not pretend, dear. We both know men like Ethan don't keep women like you around without expectation." Her words stung, sharp and calculated. Grace didn't reply. She picked up Noah, excused herself, and left the room with her head high and her heart shaking. That night, Grace avoided Ethan. She fed Emma in silence, then went straight to her room. The next day, she handed Ethan a written resignation. He read it, frowning. "What happened? Did I do something?" Grace shook her head. "No, this isn't about you. It's just time." Ethan stepped closer. "Grace, if someone said something," she stopped him. "Please, don't make this harder. I was never supposed to stay this long. I need to go back to my life. You and Emma need to start yours." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then quietly nodded. "If that's what you want, I won't stop you." Grace left 2 days later. Back in her small apartment, everything felt smaller. Noah seemed confused at first, then settled back into their old routine, but Grace couldn't shake the emptiness. She missed Emma's tiny fingers, the way the baby cooed when held close. She missed Ethan's quiet presence, his dry humor, the way he had started making pancakes every Sunday just to make Noah laugh. She told herself it was better this way, that lines had to be redrawn before things became too tangled. Yet every time she opened her phone and saw a new message from Ethan, unread and sitting in silence, she felt the pull of what they almost had. Ethan, on the other hand, spiraled quietly. He threw himself into work, leaving Emma with a rotation of highly trained nannies, none of whom lasted more than a week. Emma cried more, slept less, and refused bottles from strangers. The staff at his home tiptoed around him. He began canceling meetings, avoiding social events. At night, he sat alone in Emma's nursery, holding her until she fell asleep, wondering where everything had gone wrong. He hadn't expected to miss Grace this much. He thought it was the help, the convenience, the familiarity. But it wasn't that. It was her voice in the morning, her touch calming Emma, the way Noah's laughter filled his home like it had always belonged. He missed the way she challenged him, how she never cared about his money or his image. She had looked at him like he was a man, not a brand. One evening, after a long silence, he finally replied to one of Grace's old texts. Just a simple line. "Emma misses you. No pressure, no demands. Just the truth." Grace stared at the message for hours before responding. I miss her too. And you." She didn't expect a reply, but it came quickly. "Come over, just for a visit. No expectations. Please." Grace hesitated. Her heart told her to run toward him. Her mind reminded her of Margaret's voice, of her own fear. Still, the next morning, she packed Noah's things and drove to the mansion. Ethan opened the door himself, Emma in his arms. The baby squealed at the sight of Grace, reaching for her with both hands. Grace took her, tears pricking her eyes. Ethan didn't speak at first. He just watched them, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "I've been trying to do this without you. I thought I could, but I can't." Grace looked at him, heart pounding. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" He stepped closer. "Not help, not pity. You. I want you here because this feels like home when you are." Grace didn't answer right away. She sat on the couch, holding Emma, watching Noah crawl toward the play area like he'd never left. Her heart ached with the weight of everything unsaid. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I've been left before, lied to. I can't go through that again." Ethan knelt in front of her. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I swear to you, Grace, I see you. Not as someone temporary, not as someone filling a gap. You're not replacing anyone. You're everything I didn't know I was missing. And I don't want to lose you again." Grace closed her eyes, took a breath, and let herself believe him. Just for a moment, just enough to whisper, "Okay." For a while, things felt right. Not perfect, not without moments of doubt, but right in the way that made Grace believe maybe, just maybe, this was the life she had earned through every sleepless night and silent sacrifice. She moved back into the mansion slowly, carefully, taking each day as it came. Ethan didn't rush her. He gave her space, let her decide the pace of whatever it was they were building. They didn't call it a relationship. They didn't need to. It was a rhythm they had created together. One grounded in late-night bottle warmings, diaper changes, and quiet glances that lingered across shared meals. Noah and Emma thrived. The house, once filled with echoes and silence, now buzzed with baby giggles and the steady beat of something that resembled peace. But real life has a way of testing what feels stable. The first hit came when the press found out. A blurry photo of Ethan carrying Noah on his shoulders while Grace walked beside him with Emma in a baby carrier was all it took. The caption read, "Billionaire tech CEO rebuilding his family with mystery woman." Within days, Grace's face was on gossip sites, her past picked apart by reporters who didn't care about truth. Headlines speculated she was a gold digger, a live-in nanny-turned-lover. One article even claimed she had trapped Ethan with a child that wasn't his. Grace was humiliated. She stopped going outside. She deleted her social media. But what hurt more than the lies was how Ethan responded. Or rather, how he didn't. He didn't issue a statement. Didn't hold her hand during the chaos. He told her to ignore it, said it would pass. But Grace couldn't ignore it. She wasn't a public figure. She was a nurse, a mother, someone who had worked her whole life to protect her privacy and dignity, and now strangers whispered her name like it was scandal. The second hit came from within. Margaret returned, this time with lawyers. She claimed she was fighting for visitation rights to Emma, citing concerns about Ethan's judgment and the influence of a woman with no legal tie to the child. Grace overheard one of their conversations in the study. Margaret's voice was sharp, accusing. "This woman is a liability. She is not family. She's a placeholder for someone you lost. You're clinging to her because you're grieving." Ethan didn't defend Grace. Not the way she needed. He told Margaret to leave, but he didn't say the words Grace had hoped for. He didn't say Grace was permanent. That night, she packed a bag. Not everything, just enough. She left a note on the kitchen counter. "I love this family, but I will not be anyone's replacement. If you're not ready to choose me fully, then please don't hold me halfway." She took Noah and left before sunrise. Days passed without contact. Grace moved in with a friend across town, took a temporary shift in a nearby clinic, and enrolled Noah in a small daycare. Her heart ached, but her resolve was firm. She wouldn't raise her son in a home where she constantly questioned her place. Ethan tried calling. At first, just once. Then again. Then messages. "I miss you. Emma cries for you. Come back." Grace read them, sometimes with tears in her eyes, but she didn't respond. It wasn't until Emma's first fever that things shifted. Ethan called again, this time not to ask, but to beg. Emma was sick. The doctors said it was viral, not serious, but she wouldn't sleep, wouldn't eat, and kept crying for Grace. Ethan's voice cracked on the phone. "I'm sorry, Grace. I should have protected you. From them. From all of it. But I didn't know how. Please, just come see her." 1 hour, that's all I ask. Grace hesitated. She had built walls around her heart again, carefully, brick by brick. But she couldn't ignore the thought of Emma, sick and confused, crying for someone who wasn't there. She told herself it would only be a visit. She dressed Noah, packed a bottle, and drove back to the mansion with hands that shook. When Ethan opened the door, he didn't look like the man she had left. He looked older, more tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't try to hug her. He simply stepped aside. Grace went straight to Emma, who was curled up in her crib, whimpering. The baby reached for her instantly. Grace held her close, humming softly, and within minutes, Emma relaxed. Ethan watched from the doorway, his eyes rimmed red. Grace didn't speak at first. She focused on Emma, on her breathing, on the warmth of familiarity returning to the baby's skin. Finally, she looked up. "Why didn't you defend me? Why didn't you say I belonged?" Ethan's voice was quiet. "Because I was scared. Of saying it out loud. Of losing you anyway. I thought if I stayed silent, the storm would pass. But it didn't. It swept you away instead." Grace nodded slowly. "I needed to hear it. I needed you to say that I wasn't just filling someone else's place, that I mattered because of who I am, not who I remind you of." Ethan took a step closer. "You're not a replacement, Grace. You're the reason I started breathing again. You didn't just save Emma, you saved me. But I was too slow to see it, too afraid to say it." He paused, took a breath. "I love you, not because of what you do, not because you stepped in, but because you stayed when you didn't have to, because you made this house a home." Grace felt the walls around her heart tremble. The word she had waited for had finally come, not as a grand speech, but as a truth laid bare. She looked down at Emma, then at Ethan. "This can't be temporary," she said. "If we do this, it's all or nothing." Ethan nodded. "Then let's do all. No more halfway." In that moment, something shifted again. Not because everything was fixed, not because the world outside would suddenly be kind, but because they had chosen each other not out of need, not out of pain, but out of love. The following weeks unfolded in quiet, deliberate steps. Grace didn't move back in right away. She wanted to rebuild not just trust, but certainty. Ethan understood, or at least tried to. He showed up every day, sometimes just to bring breakfast, other times to take Noah to the park or help Grace with late-night shifts. He didn't push, didn't demand answers or timelines. He simply stayed present. One Saturday afternoon, Grace agreed to spend the weekend at the mansion. She told herself it was for Emma, for the sake of routine, not for the man whose voice had started appearing in her dreams again. The moment she stepped back into the familiar hallway, Noah ran ahead like he had never left, calling Emma's name as if she were a sibling lost, not a baby still learning to stand. That evening, as the children napped and the house fell into a golden silence, Ethan invited Grace to the garden. They sat near the stone bench where the hydrangeas bloomed, petals moving gently in the breeze. Grace spoke first. "What happens when the noise comes back? The media, your mother-in-law, the doubts? Will you choose silence again?" Ethan met her gaze. "No, I've learned what silence costs. Next time, I speak louder, not to defend myself, to defend us." Grace nodded, not fully convinced but willing to listen. The emotional twist didn't come as a thunderclap. It came softly, wrapped in an envelope, dropped into Grace's mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday. Inside was a formal letter from the state health department. Her nursing license was under review. An anonymous complaint had been filed, accusing her of violating ethical boundaries by entering a romantic relationship with the parent of a former patient while still under hospital care. Grace's hands shook. She read the letter twice, then sat on the edge of her bed, the words blurring into static. She knew it had to be Margaret. The timing, the tone, the veiled threats from weeks ago, it all added up. But none of it made the blow any easier. Her career was her identity. It had carried her through motherhood, heartbreak, and survival. Now it hung by a thread. She called Ethan, her voice flat, mechanical. He arrived 20 minutes later. When she handed him the letter, he read it in silence, then folded it carefully. "I'll take care of it. I'll bring in legal, PR, whatever it takes." Grace shook her head. "This isn't about lawyers. This is my name, my integrity. Once it's stained, I can't clean it with money." Ethan looked away, jaw tight. "She's doing this to get to me. I'll make her stop." Grace stepped closer. "I don't want revenge. I want truth. I want to be seen as more than a woman in your shadow." Ethan's expression softened. "You never were. You're the light, Grace. I was the one standing behind you." The investigation began. Grace was placed on temporary leave. Her colleagues were interviewed. Former patients' families were contacted. Ethan offered to take her and the children away just for a while, maybe a cabin or a beach house somewhere quiet, but Grace refused. Running would make her look guilty. She stayed in the city, spent her days with Noah and Emma, and waited. The waiting was worse than any confrontation. It wore her down in pieces, her confidence, her sleep, her joy. One night, as she rocked Emma to sleep, Grace whispered, "I did everything right. I saved you, I loved you, and now I might lose the one thing that helped me survive." Ethan stood in the doorway, listening. He walked in slowly, took Emma from her arms and held her tight. "You won't lose it, Grace. If the world can't see you for who you are, I'll remind them. Loudly, publicly." The next morning, Ethan released a personal statement. Not through a PR team, not filtered through lawyers, just a raw, public letter posted on every company and social media platform he had. He explained how Grace had saved Emma, not once but over and over. He wrote about her professionalism, her selflessness, her refusal to accept special treatment. He admitted his own silence and called it a mistake. He ended the letter with a line that turned viral within hours. "She wasn't the nurse who fell for a billionaire. She was the woman who taught a broken man how to be a father." Within 24 hours, support flooded in. Nurses, mothers, doctors, former patients, all sharing stories of Grace's compassion, her tireless work, her role as a healer. The narrative shifted. Still, the investigation had to follow its course. After 2 long weeks, Grace received the verdict. Her license was not suspended. The board found no ethical violation, no breach of conduct. Her actions had been rooted in medical necessity, compassion, and integrity. She was cleared. But something had shifted in her. She realized that even when the truth is on your side, the world can still doubt you. She had survived that doubt, but it left a scar, one that reminded her how fragile trust could be. Ethan took her out that night. No cameras, no fanfare, just the two of them at a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the harbor. As they ate, Ethan pulled a small box from his jacket. Grace froze. "Before you say anything," he said gently, "this isn't a proposal. Not yet. This is a key to the house, to us. I'm not asking you to say yes forever. I'm asking if you're ready to stop saying maybe." Grace opened the box. Inside was a silver key on a simple chain. She looked up. tears catching the city lights. "I'm not afraid of forever," she said. "I'm afraid of almost." Ethan nodded. "Then let's never be almost again." The emotional twist wasn't that they had fallen in love. It was that they had stayed, through fear, through fire, through the threat of losing everything. And in staying, they had turned survival into something softer, something that finally felt like home. 1 year later, the mansion no longer felt like a place built for silence. It was filled with sounds that mattered. Noah's laughter echoing down the halls, Emma's footsteps stumbling across the kitchen floor, Ethan reading bedtime stories with more animation than skill, and Grace's voice calling everyone to dinner like they were the only family that had ever existed. They didn't throw a wedding, not yet. There were no grand declarations under chandeliers, no designer gowns or camera flashes. But on a quiet Sunday morning, in the backyard under a sky soft with clouds, Ethan knelt beside Grace as their children played behind them and whispered a promise not for the world, but for her. "I will choose you every day, even when it's hard, even when I fail, and especially when I'm afraid." She didn't cry, she just smiled, because she had already known. Some truths don't need ceremonies, they only need consistency. Grace had returned to nursing, but on her own terms. She split her time between the hospital and a new nonprofit she co-founded with Ethan, an organization that provided postpartum support for mothers who had no one. They named it Emma's Light. The story of how a nurse saved a premature baby and helped a widowed father heal became more than a private memory, it became a symbol. Grace didn't want fame, she wanted impact, and now she had both. Margaret never formally apologized, but she visited the house often now, sitting quietly with Emma in the garden, sometimes bringing old photos of Isabel, whispering stories Grace knew were painful but necessary. Healing didn't come with fanfare. It came in small allowances of grace, both given and received. One evening, after both children had fallen asleep, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch swing, their hands intertwined, watching the sky shift into stars. He turned to her and said, "I used to think love came all at once, that it had to be perfect or it wasn't real. But you taught me that real love shows up slowly, stubbornly, even when you don't ask for it." Grace leaned into him, her voice quiet but firm. "Love isn't something that rescues you. It's what grows when you both choose to stay, especially when leaving might be easier." Their journey hadn't been perfect. There were nights of doubt, mornings of exhaustion, and days when the past threatened to steal their present. But they had built something not on fantasy, but on endurance, choice, and trust, rebuilt piece by piece. Grace had walked into the NICU that night expecting to finish her shift and go home. Instead, she had started a life she never planned for but somehow always needed. She hadn't saved Ethan. She hadn't even set out to love him. All she did was show up when it mattered, and somehow that had been enough. The final quote came from a note Ethan once left on her nightstand, one she found months later folded beneath a coffee cup. "You weren't the miracle. You were the one who believed we still deserved one, and you gave it to us anyway. So what would you do if your kindness changed a stranger's life? Would you walk away? Or would you stay and let that kindness change yours too?"